Welcome to Histology, where mythology and history meets. What if I told you that the greatest empire in ancient history would stand absolutely no chance against an army from 1,000 years later? The Romans conquered the known world with legendary legions, perfect discipline, and roads that connected continents. But when you pit them against the Mongol hordes of Genghis Khan, the outcome isn't even close. In the next 20 minutes, I'll reveal exactly why Roman military genius couldn't overcome Mongol innovation. But the most shocking part comes at minute 14, when I'll show you the technological gap that made this matchup completely one-sided. Let me take you back to two empires at the absolute peak of their power. The Roman Empire reached its greatest extent in 117 CE during Emperor Trajan's reign. Rome controlled the Mediterranean, vast stretches of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Their legions were unstoppable, their infrastructure unmatched, their civilization the envy of the world. But the Mongol Empire wouldn't rise until over 1,000 years later, exploding across Asia in the 13th century. Under Genghis Khan's brilliant leadership, the Mongols would conquer from China to Eastern Europe. These two military superpowers existed in completely different eras, separated by a massive time gap. Different technologies, different strategies, different worlds entirely. To understand this matchup, we need to examine what made each empire truly formidable. When you think of Rome, you think of the legion, undoubtedly the greatest military force of its time. Disciplined, organized, absolutely devastating in formation. Roman legionaries trained relentlessly to fight in tightly coordinated units. They didn't just fight well as individuals. They worked as a perfect team, moving like a single organism. This teamwork gave them an enormous advantage against less organized enemies. Roman shields locked together created an impenetrable wall of steel and wood. Their gladius swords thrust through gaps with deadly precision. But here's where the Roman war machine had a critical weakness that would prove fatal. Most Roman legions severely lacked heavy cavalry. The entire military system was built around infantry dominance. The Romans only started developing serious heavy cavalry during Emperor Hadrian's reign around 130 CE. They created these units mainly to counter Eastern powers like the Sassanids and Parthians who relied on mounted warriors. The first Roman cataphract units were stationed in Lower Moesia along the frontier. But even these armored cavalry were relatively basic, using only partial armor that offered limited protection. Hold on to this detail, because the absence of effective cavalry becomes absolutely crucial soon. Now let's shift our focus to the Mongols, and you'll immediately see why this matchup becomes so lopsided. Under Genghis Khan's leadership, the Mongol Empire became an unstoppable military juggernaut. Mongol troops were renowned throughout the world for one thing above all else: mobility. Their cavalry wasn't just fast. It was devastatingly effective, turning speed into a weapon. The Mongol army consisted mostly of horse archers who could ride at full gallop while firing arrows. The composite bows they used were engineering marvels, capable of hitting targets at long distances with tremendous force. But the Mongols weren't just about speed, they were tactical geniuses who mastered complex battlefield maneuvers. One of their most famous tactics was the feigned retreat. Mongol forces would pretend to flee in panic, drawing overconfident enemies into pursuit. Then, when the enemy broke formation chasing what they thought was a defeated army, the Mongols would suddenly wheel around and annihilate them in a carefully prepared ambush. Remember this tactic, because at minute 14 I'll show you exactly how this would devastate Roman formations. The Mongols were also masters of multi-front attacks, striking from multiple directions simultaneously. Perhaps their most terrifying advantage was their ability to cover enormous distances in a single day. Mongol armies could appear seemingly out of nowhere, strike with overwhelming force, and vanish before reinforcements arrived. So now comes the question that's been building: who would actually win this epic confrontation? As powerful as the Roman legions were, with their sophisticated infrastructure, they simply couldn't match Mongol speed. Let me give you a clear example of how this battle would unfold. Mongol horse archers would strike Roman formations from distance, firing devastating volleys of arrows. Then they'd retreat before the Romans could close for hand-to-hand combat. The Mongols would attack again at different points on the battlefield, constantly moving, never committing to prolonged engagement. Slowly, methodically, they'd wear down Roman forces without ever giving the legions a chance to use their superior close combat training. The Romans would be fighting an enemy they could never catch, never pin down, never force into the kind of battle where Roman discipline could dominate. It would be like trying to fight smoke. But here's where the technology gap becomes truly impossible to overcome. The Mongols were operating in a much more advanced era compared to the Romans. At their peak, Rome used basic siege engines, onagers, catapults, and ballistae. These were useful but centuries behind the innovations the Mongols brought. By the 13th century, the Mongols were already using gunpowder and far more sophisticated siege machinery. Let me give you an analogy that perfectly captures this divide. Imagine a medieval warrior with a sword and shield facing a modern soldier with a firearm. The medieval warrior might be incredibly skilled, and his shield might protect against some weapons. But he'd stand no chance against the range and precision of a firearm. This is exactly how a Mongol-Roman battle would play out. The Romans were superbly organized and magnificently trained in close combat. But they lacked the advanced technology the Mongols possessed. Long-range composite bow archery that outclassed anything Rome had. Gunpowder explosives for sieges and battlefield chaos. Advanced siege equipment that could reduce fortifications the Romans thought impregnable. The technology gap was simply too vast to overcome. Before we continue, please subscribe to Histology to support us. Your subscription helps us create more incredible historical analyses like this one. Mongol cavalry had an overwhelming tactical advantage over Roman infantry, especially in open terrain. The Romans would need to close distance for hand-to-hand combat where their training could shine. But the Mongols' mobility made closing that distance nearly impossible. Roman legionaries would march forward in formation, shields raised, trying to reach the enemy. Meanwhile, Mongol horse archers would circle around them, firing from all sides, never staying still. Of course, the Romans were incredibly formidable in their own style of warfare. In confined terrain, they might hold out for a while. But the harsh reality is this: in a direct confrontation on open ground where mobility matters, the Mongols would dominate. They were faster, more flexible, and far more adaptable to changing battlefield conditions. This isn't about courage or training or discipline. Roman legionaries were among the bravest soldiers in history. But courage can't overcome a fundamental technological and tactical disadvantage of this magnitude. The Mongols conquered nearly every civilization they encountered across Asia and Europe. They defeated armies with cavalry, fortifications, and numerical superiority. The tactics that made Roman legions unstoppable against Carthage, Gaul, and Germania simply wouldn't work against the Mongols. The Mongols would dictate when, where, and how battle was fought. And here's the modern lesson: technological and tactical superiority often matters more than tradition or courage. Today's military strategists still study Mongol tactics, mobility, deception, psychological warfare, and combined arms effectiveness. So in the end, despite Rome's legendary status and legions that conquered the known world, the Mongols would emerge victorious. Not because Romans were weak, but because the Mongols represented a quantum leap in military evolution.